The Confederate Civil War, which has engaged in the Espionage War against the United States, has set up exponential catastrophic collapsing functions which have actively targeted Americans in order to engage in their secret communism or wizard communism, which is engaged in the exchanges of resources for the redistribution of wealth to the white nationalist approved arrangements, such as the Nazi agreement to engage in the promotion of white supremacists getting the higher rate contracts for companies, which makes them uh, Klan loyalists, and the Klan loyalists who support the terrorism against the general law-abiding public engage in the acceleration in the corporate arrangements, which actively is connected inside the legislator, which actively is subordinated to those functions, at which point the white supremacists, by their arrangements of predetermining winners and losers inside of the market, have arranged for these damages so that they can control the system for the systematic racism to be as a parasite infecting a host, controlling the host, and preventing it from betraying the foreign or alien entity of the parasite of the white supremacists engaged in the coup against the general public, including the double agents inside the legislature who are planning to become obsolete as they cycle out of office into the predetermined allotment, creating the wizard government of the unitary executive, all powers of the government removed from checks and balances and co-equal systems into the centralized government or shadow government. And it being centralized into the president is dissolved into plausible deniability, redistributing the powers of the presidency to the inferior functions, ignoring the hierarchy for their arbitrary actions of the espionage engaged in the total threats to the general society by the phantom cells, which includes but is not limited to the type of thing where they, I don't know, burn down the houses in Hawaii, which frees up the land to be taken, similar to the point of origin of the United States claiming Hawaii, which has systematically generated similar frauds, which systematically puts into the disadvantage of the victims who, being forced to settle with the damages because they were not protected by the American government, which was infected by the insurrectionists, creates Jay Sekulo's terrorist arrangements where he's actively hired terrorists who he's claimed to um, have a right to their terrorism protected by the double agents, such as the federal judges disloyal to their office, stopping any remedy to their terrorist operations, which actively includes the function of Jay Sekulow accepting all collateral damage or Trump accepting collateral damage from any of the injuries that they accept, at which point their position is the persistent arrangement of redistributing the debts and liabilities under their frauds, which cannot be accepted by the Americans, and thus the series of backstabbing scenarios, such as the deep study of their goddess Lolth from D&D, is the only way to competently understand the structure and form of their society, as their redistribution of wealth requires the damages to exist so that they can redistribute it to somebody else under a series of fraudulent contracts, such as the increased funding to the defenses that ignore the responsibility to defend, like a fire department, which watches a building burn without putting out the fire because they are contracted to retaliate against the target who they arranged for the building to burn down. At that point, you have the act of William Barr's agreement that the government officials have to be bartered with individually for the sake of corruption, with full respect as the individual absolute autonomy of the arbitrary arrangements for their agreement to engage in wizard domination of the general public as a replacement to any law enforcement functions, and thus the complete disillusionment of public services or the purposes of government, requiring individual security, such as the increase of individually owned firearms to protect against these types of damages, and collective agreements against the subversion, which is constantly being targeted by the psyops, thus creating an escalation of ever evolving threats, which has to be maintained as the agreement for the various factions of the Confederacy has created threats that can only be solved by those arrangements, which have predetermined schedules to meet each checkpoint primarily. So those threats against those lives under that arrangement requires the self-armed public, which is actively being subverted by the Democrats who are against individual ownership of firearms, which generates the disadvantage of not being able to defend yourself against the threat, creating the removal of all remedies to the system until the entire arrangement of security collapses into the single domination by the wizard cult, at which point you have the arrangements of the permanent vulnerability without rights to arbitrary abuses for the sake of itself, at the enjoyment and lust of loss-based chaos, which generates the disposition for the general public to suffer while tyranny is sufferable, which is as long as they're alive, because they can't do anything about it because they refuse to protect themselves, which is the fundamental concept of the War on David, which generates the position of having committed the sedition against all parts of the government that would protect the public, at which point they, being distributed as property, cannot consider themselves anything above arbitrary property or animals, which cannot be acknowledged as people, and without the powers and privileges of a person, they can be bought and sold as slaves under some kind of eminent domain arrangement, fraudulently representing the subversion of all legal limitations as they remove the cuffs of law in favor of their arbitrary profits and ambitions for the collective fraud of the wizard cult in charge. The kind of people who are interested in those advantages are normal victims of cults, but the contradiction and the oxymorons requires the arrangement of the construction of cult leaders, which by definition will still fall for the cult supporter problem, and thus you have the con artist who is the mark to be the con, at which point the construction of the higher levels requires more and more competence, which becomes harder and harder to defraud from systems of collapse and control, at which point the systems of them not being able to resist the collective cult leader at the top generates the position that even if they were directly against the cult leader at the top, they couldn't do anything about it because they are subordinate member at the downline, which generates the position of people revealing slowly who their leaders and gods are, at which point the function of the children of God and other cults at the top of the white supremacists in control, operating the KKK operations, engaging in the removal of remedies to their magic systems, would reveal on maturity their worship of devils, and thus their Satanist, unironic belief in the existence of a Satan by which to worship generates the position of going after him in favor of the advantages of a real life deliverable product for a real life Satan, which generates the positions of perpetual marks, including the function of extortions, and all extortions require the use of theft, which requires a mark by which to steal from, including the functions of the higher levels of the stages, which ends at the Satanist, which requires the human sacrifices, which requires the engagement of the prison industrial complex by which to destroy lives as a pre-hell before they engage in the sacrifices of the lives as they engage in their cult sacrifices separate to that system outside of the service to law illusion, which is actively being defrauded by their magic, which defrauds the government for a false conviction, which is the active racket which they have generated in order to engage under lawfare without law or law without justice, at which point the functions of protocols that subvert the objective of the office or law becomes the primary issue, at which point the use of process in order to defraud the system away from getting a competent verdict, which the process was created in order to acquire, undermines the definition and thus changes the meaning of the word, creating an alternate reality where the system with the same word has a different meaning on the basis of your degree of elevation. You may have ascended to one definition or another, at which point you have the active mechanism of their magic frauds, which has engaged in compelled morality to the removal of life, which is existence and human decency, for the complete removal of liberty to self-determine your pursuit of your own happiness in your own arbitrary ways, including the function of the removal of your right to religion, as the subordination to these functions is the compulsion to worship the devil and the cult mechanism supporting the devils at the levels of occult concealment, uh, abhorrence to the existence of the revelation of the cult function as a devil worshipping function, which engages in the activity of criminalizing evidence as a foundational tenet of their cult backstabbing society, as their pirate society requires the existence of something to steal from, as a parasite needs a host, at which point the parasite releases a toxin in order to turn the immune system against itself. At that point, any function of the host that would have conducted the security would be seized for sedition to be accomplished, for the damages and the treason to be successful, and thus any mechanism such as David inside the United States government conducting intelligence oversight for its military police in order to stop the white supremacist insurgency would be seized in an act of sedition for the specific purpose of the devil worshipping wizard cult. So, as a little thought experiment, what happens if you have David's character go into Las Vegas in order to conduct his normal engagements with all of the normal luxuries of Las Vegas? Well, in the reduced level, he's leaving the white supremacist jurisdictions where they're robbing him, at which point the interest is for him to gamble and to succeed, at which point the assumption is that they would not turn on him in order to start losing, so that he could maintain his human decency, so that he could spend money in the local areas, especially into the shops where the gambling centers are themselves in the same buildings, because that's the functional business model sustaining the thing. At which point, the total resource capitalist answer is they need him to win and to spend locally, and they need that to be the sustaining of his original human decency at the reduced level, because if the Americans win, they'll release his accounts, and then this is a place that he would have considered more connected to his human decency and thus closer to home, and thus a larger place to dump a bunch of money. At which point, the trillions of dollars as owed to him being divided into millions of dollars makes him a whale gambler at the end goal prosperity, at which point the long-term investment is their primary business strategy in a capitalist arrangement, unless of course they are controlled or influenced by the white supremacists conducting the cult ritual, who engage in the use of that and attach a con in order to extort them into their own collapse, as the backstabbing society is one of stabbing each other in the back, at which point the undermining of each other's profit motives engages into the singular goal of the profit motive while stealing it from everyone else, ending in a position of those who are the most influential into the agreement, which often is set up into an illusionary scenario where their status is fraudulent and non-sustainable in the actual arrangements, which is a trap for their own destruction, which collapses the system into betraying them under their own agreements and strategies, which they knew about and understood that every other player was doing the exact same thing, making them a fool who fell for occult practice in order to be defrauded in a gamble for gambits that they knew that they had low chances to no chances in order to win, as they, primarily understanding the advantage of the house, understood that they were not the house in those gambles, at which point they understood that they were throwing it away consciously in favor of the subconscious objective of whatever thing they were baited with, knowing that it would be fraudulent as an illusion that could not be consumed themselves. So, as a generic example, which may or may not be useful to anyone particularly, you have the infinite divisions of these types of examples, such as those who are from our what we've just discussed engaged in the profit motive of gambling prevented from the advantage, because the advantage of the house is the advantage of owning the building, is the advantage of leasing out the locations to the shops who are paying to be there, and thus the funding of the shops is a consistent stability or a short for their money grabbing, allowing themselves the permanent sustenance and the promise of sustenance stabilizing their permanent returns, at which points that would have been the ultimate goal for many of these locations, which by definition would actively pursue those advantages, which also attracts other gamblers, and the function of hyping the winning streaks and other arrangements which could be arranged in the observation of the normal course of events would actively encourage higher grade spending on those locations, unless, of course, the gambling was based on the gambling, similar to the stock market, to practices that had stopped, such as the gambling on whether or not an action is going to be taken, and the arbitrary gambling on whether or not the thing will be go this way, that, or the other way, understanding that it could be rigged is the functional fraud that has been arranged in most of the exchanges based in the cult from the white supremacists, from the terrorists, uh, exceeding the function of law and service to law in order to engage in their armed robberies and various arrangements, which are the trap to themselves to be destroyed by the mechanism that they agree to, and thus they are a suicide bomber cult. And again, it is most important that you understand the core principle that every con requires the thing to look like it is a legitimate, stable thing. The more legitimate and practical the thing looks, the more effective the con is. The more reasonable it looks, the more people will join it, the easier it is to con them when you pull the rug underneath their feet, proving that the thing that would have been stable if you had just done competent business is in fact fraud, which is exponentially loot stealing most of the money in favor of not working so that they can take the short and the robbery profits. Again, ultimately in this arrangement, that uh, sign of stability and competence is the rule of law, of the laws of nature and reason, and thus the highest logical reason and law and order being the stability is the most legitimate thing to provide confidence to. So when they use corruption in order to pull the rug for reason itself, it then collapses into chaos and anarchy for the short, which is their primary business model, to defraud off of the thing that they would have done better if they had just done the work, instead of defaulting on the objective to take it regardless of the outcome of the reasonable due diligence of any direction that it would take, which is the function of shorting it for the profits of destruction, for the express purpose of having a weakened general society. And with the weakened society, you have a weakened market, and thus you have the inferior capability of sustaining yourself as a peaceful member of the general public, because there is less of stability in the general public unless there are fewer safe people in general public, and thus the advantage of stealing is preferred over the advantage of profits, and thus they would rather have 100,000 over 500,000 if the neighbors and such would have a relevant amount of money. If they have 500,000 but everyone else has a million, then they would rather destroy the general profits of the society in favor of having the $100,000 if everyone else is reduced to the $70,000, at which point the arrangement of posturing by comparison is the hierarchy of the backstabbing society of the pirate nation which is in control, which leads to the Lord of Ooze, which, as a functional socialist in D&D, engages in the function of creating everyone to be equally weak, as the arrangement is the disillusionment of all value, starting at the use of chaos to collapse those of power into dissolving them into the general weakness along with everyone else, so everyone becomes equally poor, equally pathetic, equally snide and useless,